Happy Black Friday. Welcome back to Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. If you are listening to this, then maybe you're out and about doing Black Friday things. Maybe you're being more sensible and staying at home because it's awful out there on Black Friday. I am your host, Ryan Krim, and I welcome you to this podcast about board games. We're going to have a great show here today. Today I'm going to be talking about some games that I've played recently. Then we're going to move on to the feature game of the week. This is the fourth week of the month, so it's a favorites week, a week where I talk about one of my favorite board games, and today it's going to be Resident Evil, the deck building game. Please don't turn the podcast off yet, having heard that. I promise it'll be good. As a quick reminder for those of you who have been here before, or for those that are new, we don't talk about rules here on Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. I might touch briefly on some rules here and there, but if you'd like to know how a game is played before you hear my thoughts on them, please check out the links of this podcast or this video. I will be placing links in the description that give solid rules explanations for all the games I'm going to be talking about today. But that's enough introduction, let's get on with it. I've recently had a chance to play Lisboa again. Lisboa is a game designed by Vitor Lacerda, and it is published by Eagle Gryphon Games. I really like Lisboa. I'm sad that it's taken me as long to get back to the game as it has. This is, as I said, a game by Vitor Lacerda. It's one of two Lacerda games that I've played. Vitor Lacerda is a pretty heavyweight designer. All of his designs that I'm aware of come in the medium heavy to heavyweight category, which means there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot to pay attention to. There's a lot of things you can miss. And there's a lot of depth to the decision making you have to make. And Lisboa is really kind of a poster child for that kind of game design. Lisboa is an interestingly deep game with a number of interlocking systems that really play off each other very, very well. This is the kind of game I prefer as opposed to a game like Trajan, which is more or less a collection of separate mini games kind of loosely held together by the fact that they're on the same game board. I think Trajan's a fine game for what it is, but if I had to pick between the two, I'd definitely pick a game like Lisboa because I like it when my decisions really play into one another, and when one decision on anywhere on the board can affect many other decisions I might make. I guess, admittedly, Trajan does that a little bit as well, but it's far more prominent in a game like Lisboa. When I went back to read the rulebook again, because it had been so long since I played this, every time I'd read an action, I'd think, oh man, that's a great first action, a great way to start off the game. And then I get on to the next action, and I think, well, actually, the first action would be much better if I did this one first, because then it would make it more optimized, or I'd get better rewards, or just something better would come from it because I did this action first. But then I move on to the next action, and I think, oh, but if I did this first, then the previous action would be even better, and that would make the other action even better. And that's just kind of the way all the actions in Lisboa work. A great example is building a ship. Building a ship seems like a really great first turn move because it opens up an opportunity to score points if your opponents want to sell goods for money. But if you slot a person into your portfolio first, you get a bonus to your reputation when you build your ship. And so the question becomes, do I want to build my ship now and score less reputation, or wait a turn and maybe score more reputation, but maybe be the second person to build a ship so I get actually fewer rewards? I know that can be a lot to take in if you haven't played the game before and you don't know the rules, but I use it as an example to show that almost every action in this game can be supported by another action. There's no clear starting strategy that I can see that's better than another. There are so many branching ways to do things in this game. And really, for a game that's got so much to do and so much to keep track of, it's amazing how balanced it all really is. This last game that we played, I thought I was so far ahead of the rest of the table. And by all rights, it looked like I was so far ahead. I completed 5 rebel sets before anybody else had completed 3. I had built a whole bunch of buildings. And then when it came down to scoring, I did win, but I barely won due to the tiebreaker rules. And the third person was just right behind us. So there's so much to do. Everything is balanced really very well. And it's a game that I'd love to return to and play some more. It really is a shame it had been so long since I played it last. If I had any complaints about it from the few plays I've had with it, there is a definite disconnect between the theme and the mechanics, but really that only exists on the surface level. If you do a deep dive into the rulebook actually does a great job of explaining the decision process for how certain mechanics were refined through the design process and how those mechanics relate actually to the theme, to people who were actually rebuilding Lisbon during this time period. So there's actually a lot of thought built into the theme and the mechanics of this game, but because it doesn't really show through on the game surface, I can hardly blame people for missing that. But I appreciate those details being in the rule book because for those that want to search for deeper meaning in collecting rebel cubes and playing face cards and doing things like that, it's there. And it's got some interesting history stuff in the book as well, if that's something you're interested in. That's the kind of stuff you usually see in games from like Matt Garrett's or designers like that. And I appreciate little touches and flourishes that are present in games like Lisboa. In terms of other Vital Lacerda games, I would love to play Vinhos. I think that's how it's pronounced. I like playing Viticulture, another wine brewing selling game, but Viticulture is more about drawing really good cards and kind of there's more of a luck factor involved there. From what I've seen of Vinhos, it's far more deterministic and does seem to be a little bit more focused on the wine making aspect of the game, which is something that I think is interesting. But I'd also be really interested in trying the Gallerist because I think that's a fantastically underused theme. Running an art gallery, I think that's a cool idea. So I'd like to explore more Vito Lacerda games in the future. If they just weren't so dang expensive, I probably would have done so already. But that was Lisboa, designed by Vito Lacerda and published by Eagle Gryphon Games. Moving on, I got to play San Juan. This is a game designed by Andreas Seyfarth, and it is published by Ravensburger. San Juan is the card game implementation of Puerto Rico. Kind of in the same game as Castles of Burgundy, the card game, or the Kodachi implementation for Ninjato. I like the game that San Juan is based on Puerto Rico quite a bit, despite its somewhat unsavory connotation in regards to forced labor, because I like the action selection system that it implements. I like the way it requires you to plan ahead in order to create opportunities that benefit you as much as you can while minimizing how much they benefit your opponents. In fact, in many ways, Puerto Rico, and by conjunction San Juan, as they both use essentially the same system, stands out as one of the best games that utilizes this kind of action selection mechanism. I like the way it's implemented here better than I like it in other games that implement this kind of action selection system, like in Rising Sun, for example. I've talked about Rising Sun very briefly here before. I think Rising Sun, for what it is an exceptional game. It doesn't quite hit all the beats it tries to hit, but it doesn't really fall on its face either. The action selection mechanism in Rising Sun is essentially the same as it is in a game like Puerto Rico. And I'm not quite sure where the big difference comes in. I think part of it is because in Rising Sun, you're actually taking far fewer actions, or you're selecting far fewer actions than you are in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, you're probably going to be selecting an action 15, 20 times, whereas in Rising Sun, in a 5-player game, you might be selecting actions like 4 or 5 times over the course of the game. And so to compensate for that, every action that gets selected is proportionally more powerful per player than it is in Puerto Rico or in San Juan. And now I've gotten way off track. So to step back a little bit, what I like about the way the mechanic is implemented in Puerto Rico and in turn San Juan is it forces you to really plan ahead. You have to constantly be evaluating not just what you need now, but what your opponents need, and then what you and your opponents are going to be needing in the following turn. And all the time, you also need to keep track of who's going to be the first player in the next coming round. Because nothing feels better when playing a game like this than when you produce a bunch of goods in a round where your opponents can't do anything. They don't benefit at all from the action because their stores are already full. You can set up great moments like that in Puerto Rico or in San Juan. You can set up moments where you score a bunch of points, or I guess in terms of San Juan specifically, you can set up tons of situations where you can draw a bunch of cards or you can do a bunch of something while your opponents are just kind of like, oh, well, we don't get to do anything for your action. And it's not easy to do, but it's the most efficient way to take an action. And every time you get to a point where you can do that, you feel pretty clever. San Juan stands out against Puerto Rico for a couple of reasons in my mind. First off, it plays ideally with 3 people, at least according to Board Game Geek, and really I think I agree with that assessment. At 3 players, rounds are lightning quick. You can get through this game in probably 30 minutes easy with players that are familiar with the cards and the rules. Plus, in COVID times where game groups are disrupted, I can get a game of San Juan in with 3 people while remaining socially conscious pretty easily. Plus, even in general, just getting 3 people together for a game is much easier a lot of the time than getting 4 or 5 people together, at least from my experience. Secondly, I've got an undeniable satisfaction with the way San Juan utilizes its deck. I think it's a stroke of brilliance that literally everything in the game is handled using cards. Resources, currency, buildings, everything is done using just a deck of cards, and I think it's a stroke of genius. You do see this kind of thing in Castles of Burgundy, the card game as well, but come on, that game came out like 12 years later. and it uses those awful little cards. And I don't know about anybody else, but I have a hard time handling those smaller cards despite not having any particular dexterity issues. They're just, I don't know what it is about them. Cards that are too small, I don't like. Cards that are too big, I also don't like. Just use standard size cards in games where you're going to be keeping a hand of cards. Don't even get me started on the Valley of the Kings reprint that was a deck building game using all tarot size cards. What? What? Why? Anyway, to address the elephant in the room, I guess here at the tail end of my discussion of San Juan, I've been led to understand that San Juan is mechanically very similar to Race for the Galaxy, but I can't comment on that comparison because I've never actually played Race for the Galaxy. I know that ruins my street cred, but I've only played Roll for the Galaxy as that's what's available in our group. So I've never actually gotten around to playing Race. I do think I would like Race for the Galaxy quite a bit, just from what I've seen. But in terms of a game of San Juan's weight, San Juan is much easier to teach and play. It's a much lighter fare than Race for the Galaxy is. And so while I'm sure I would enjoy Race for the Galaxy, I probably would keep them distinct in my mind just because of the length of play, time, and the overall weight of the game. And that was San Juan, designed by Andreas Seyferth and published by Ravensburger. All right, so now we're moving on to the game of the week. This is again the fourth week of the month, which means it's a favorites edition. On the fourth week of the month, I like to take a step back and consider some of my favorite games of all time. And this week it is Resident Evil, the deck building game, designed by Tyler Allender and published by Bandai. Please don't run away. I understand that this is a strange game to be talking about. It's a game that at first glance just looks like a ripoff of a existing deck building game with a theme from a well-known IP just kind of slapped onto it and thrown onto store shelves. But there's a lot of really good stuff going on with Resident Evil, the deck building game. So again, I understand that this might seem a little strange from the offset, but stick with me for a moment and everything will start to make sense as I talk about it a little bit. Now, for the sake of full disclosure, I'm going to be level with you. I am, of course, a big fan of the Resident Evil franchise. I think the recent remakes for Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 are some of the best HD remakes we've seen in video game history. In most cases, I admit this would probably lead to some sort of bias in terms of considering a card game or board game adaptation, but I'm confident in my opinion of Resident Evil, the deck building game, as being a solid game in its own right, and I'm here to make my case for that. To back up a little bit, Resident Evil, the deck building game, was published in 2010. This is during the deck building craze that followed Dominion's release in 2008. So there's an obvious comparison to be made here. You don't need to look any further than the static market system to realize that Resident Evil is based heavily on Dominion, as essentially all deck building games are. Many people will take one look at that and immediately dismiss this kind of a game as simply a ripoff of an established formula, which I think is an unfair assessment. Creative works are, by nature, iterative in process. Movies, novels, video games are what they are today because of the conventions established by past work. Everything you see in a movie today is the way it is because of how movies have been shot for the past 70 to 80 to, I don't know how long, 100 years. But that does not necessarily excuse the undeniable similarities between Resident Evil and Dominion. So I want to give my quick thoughts on Dominion as a game. Dominion is a solid game that has had an undeniable impact on the world of hobby board games. And to be honest, I like it just fine. There are definitely times where I don't mind just sitting down to a game of Dominion and do nothing more than build a card engine that's as refined as it can possibly be. But it's never a game that I'm going to pull off the shelf without being prompted to. Deck building for deck building's sake was a novel concept when Dominion was released. But I like to have a little bit more going on in my games. That's why I tend to gravitate towards games like Trains or Resident Evil. Oh, and it doesn't help that I find Dominion's theme and artwork to be just as dull as possible. But that's a lesser point. I know there are plenty of people that would differ with me on that, but it seems a real shame to have a game with hundreds of cards that just have dull, generic, fantasy-esque art on them. Just as much as it's a shame to have a card game that's made entirely of screen caps, like the legendary Buffy game or the awful Spider-Man Homecoming expansion for Legendary. But to return to Dominion, I've only played the base game and one expansion, and I can't even remember which expansion it was. So I recognize that some of the things I'll talk about in Resident Evil might be things that are added to Dominion through various expansions, since there's more expansions for Dominion than there have been adapted versions of A Christmas Carol. So while an expansion may exist that also includes some of these things that I wish were in Dominion, I can't speak to them because I haven't played all the expansions for Dominion. But these are things that Resident Evil does well that I think elevate it. And again, I get that this is going to be a divisive topic, but again, elevates the Resident Evil game in my mind. The first and most obvious of these is the Mansion deck. In Resident Evil, the deck building game, the player that wins is the player that has received the most commendations. Commendations come from killing zombies, or as the game calls them, infected. This is done by taking a explore action. Every player has one default explore action they can take on their turn, which is to flip over the top of the mansion deck and then fight whatever monster appears. You fight that monster with any weapons you've played from your hand that you have ammo for fueling. And then once you defeat a monster, if you do, you place it underneath your character card, and each monster has a certain number of accommodations it provides, and those are essentially your points for winning the game. It also increases your character level, which gives you more abilities, but we'll talk about that more in a little bit. This mansion deck adds one of the core elements to Resident Evil that Dominion is missing for me, which is a functional goal. It operates in the same way that the board operates in trains. It gives you something to focus your attention on aside from just buying points. It also acts as the timer for the game and actually does something very clever in terms of game pacing. But I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Another key difference that Resident Evil has that I think adds considerably to the experience is the fact that your money cards have a dual purpose. I love it when games are multi-use with their components. And so I like the way that Resident Evil treats your money cards not just as money, but also as ammo. So that creates some interesting decision making where there are going to be turns where you have to decide whether it's worth it to use your money cards as ammo for the turn to explore or whether it's worth it to buy something from the market. Now, this isn't always a difficult decision, of course. There are going to be plenty of turns where what you should do is somewhat obvious, where you have a ton of ammo and no weapons, so you're going to use it as money. But there are just enough turns where you draw a nice balanced hand where you have to decide, okay, I have enough stuff here now to do a pretty good explore and could probably kill a pretty big beastie. But I could also just buy this card I've been saving up for a while. And then, the question becomes, well, maybe do I split down the middle? Do I buy something that's not as expensive so I can still explore? Or do I just spend it all on an item? There are decisions like that that crop up more and more as the game progresses and as you get more and more weapons and more higher value ammo and gold cards into your hand. And that's the kind of decision making that I like to see in a game like this. Anytime you can add multifunction card systems into your game, it's going to be better in my opinion. Of course, you can get too complex with things like that, but Resident Evil doesn't do it. Ammo or money, that's it. The third major difference that Resident Evil gives is it has the character cards, and these make a huge difference in a number of ways. First off, they give you some really cool variable player powers, which is always something I'm interested in. But more importantly, these variable player powers open up some really interesting avenues of gameplay that you might not always get to try out. See, each character has 1 to 2 skills, and those skills get unlocked as you kill enemies. The accommodations that you earn from killing enemies feed into your level, and then once you've reached enough accommodations to level up, you get access to the skill of your character. And those skills can do really cool things to the systems in the game. The Krauser character is a perfect example of this. His special abilities give you bonuses for playing knives. Now, knives are not normally something that's worth investing much money in. They don't require any ammo to play to explore with, but they only do like 5 damage, so they're typically not worth buying very many of. But if you're playing as Krauser, suddenly those knives become more and more powerful and they become more attractive as options. Up to a point where you can create a strategy where you're just playing with a deck full of knives and you can actually be competitive. And that's one of the things I like seeing upgrades and variable player powers do in a game. Take cards that you normally wouldn't get to use or wouldn't want to invest much time in, and turn them into something that's actually very powerful. In a way, that's one of the things I really like about Arkham Horror, the living card game. I love it when a new character comes out with a special ability that takes cards that are really not very good in most situations and suddenly turns them into very desirable cards that you can make great use of. And Resident Evil does a bunch. There's a ton of different characters that utilize a ton of different mechanics, not just in weapons, but in giving you abilities that let you trash cards from your hand, that let you power up your allies, that let you avoid infection cards, which I'll talk about more in a second. The variable player powers are a great addition to Resident Evil, and one of the reasons why a game is so high on my list of favorites. Now, there are some other minor differences, but these are really the major ones that really makes the game stand out and defines Resident Evil as its own game. Now, to take a step back for a second, I'd said before that the mansion acts as a timer for the game, and that it does something very clever in dictating the game's pace, and I want to return to that for a second. The best way I can illustrate the way that the mansion deck does this is by recounting one of my earliest plays of Resident Evil, the deck building game. When I first played Resident Evil, I'd played Dominion several times, so I had a pretty good idea of how deck building games are played. So when I went into Resident Evil, I thought I had a very firm idea of what I should be doing. Over the course of the game, I carefully crafted the best little engine ever. I had a deck full of powerful weapons, high power ammo, and by the time I started going through the mansion, I was knocking down doors and blasting zombies with reckless abandon because I knew I could easily overpower just about anything in the deck. But by the time I got to that point, the game was actually already almost over, and when it ended, I was way far behind. See, while I was focused on building this fantastic deck, other players had taken a more balanced approach and had been exploring the deck long before I did. This resulted in them taking damage and sometimes losing turns, but ultimately they ended the game with much higher scores than I did. And that made me realize what the mansion is actually doing for the game. It acts as the clock, right? The game ends once a certain monster has been killed in the mansion. But it also is meant to push players to start exploring early in order to rack up points, gain commendations, level up your characters, and not just sit around crafting a deck like I did. I like this because it allows the length of the game to be dictated by the players. Now, if you've got a table full of people who are focused on deck building like I was, the game's going to last a long time. But add one person into the mix that's willing to take some risk, and the pace of the game is going to accelerate considerably to a point that it's a much more reasonable pace. Now, admittedly, there are probably going to be situations where you don't have that one player that's going to be exploring early. But luckily, there is an expansion that solves that. And with that transition into talking about the expansions for Resident Evil, the deck building game, I need to state my feelings for the game up front. Obviously, I love Resident Evil, the deck building game. I'm here talking about it during my favorite section, my favorites week of the month. But while I love Resident Evil, the deck building game, I really can't recommend it to anybody, at least not by itself. Now, don't take this as one of those abominable mid-review turnarounds that I think are far too prevalent in the board game review industry. But here's the deal. The base game, as much as I enjoy it, has a few flaws that can lead it to be very frustrating for people. And when I read reviews for this game, all the negative reviews I see pretty much talk about these frustrating aspects of the game. Which is sad because they are easily answered with expansions, but you have to kind of have some expansions. The first issue is that while the mansion deck does act as a means of dictating the pace of the game, it isn't always effective in doing so. Like I said before, if you don't have that player that's exploring early, the game can pretty easily devolve to a point where nobody is exploring the mansion until everybody's got strong decks. And in that situation, you're looking at an hour and a half to 2 hour game, which is way longer than the game should be lasting. It also leads to a very anticlimactic second half of the game because by the time you've got a really powerful deck, nobody has to really fear what they're going to flip over, and so there's no suspense of going through the mansion deck. The second main issue is that the deck just doesn't really have enough low power creatures. And because the rules dictate that you shuffle the whole thing before starting, it's all too common that exploring early will result in a suicide mission. It's not impossible at all to hit the big boss early on, leading to your death in the first few turns, which is incredibly frustrating, if for no other reason than the fact that now you've been set behind. So, how do the expansions address these issues? Well, the expansions are phenomenal. In fact, Resident Evil, the deck building game, to me, is the definitive game that improves significantly as you add expansions in. In fact, after all of my plays of playing Resident Evil, the deck building game, I have fine-tuned the experience into the perfect way to play, which is a marvelous secret that I'll reveal at the end of the discussion here. But first, we're going to talk about all the expansions. I'm going to sort them in order of necessity. I think they're all good to have if you like this game. I would recommend all of them, but if you don't have access to them all, or if you want to know what order to prioritize getting them in, here is my recommendation. The most notable expansion is the Outbreak expansion, which adds by far the most important mechanic, which is the Infection deck. When you play with the Infection deck, you have a drawback for every time you don't explore the mansion. Every time you don't explore the mansion, you draw a card from what's called the Infection deck, and you set it beside your play area. If at any point in time you hit 10 Infection cards, your character dies, you put your deck away, shuffle up your infection deck, and you become a zombie. And now your win condition is no longer to kill the big baddie in the mansion deck, but to either kill all the other players or turn them into infected themselves. This edition is phenomenal because it not only picks up the pace of the game, it adds some really excellent, agonizing decision making. You've got a little bit of leeway where you can get 10 infection cards before you turn, which gives you, 4 or 5 turns at the very beginning of the game to start getting an engine going, but you really have to start looking and planning to do explorations early on. You can't just sit around on your laurels and wait for the perfect hand. You have to start going at it early because you can't let your infection level get too high. Because there are things like monsters in the deck that will raise the infection level of everybody at the table. So while it can be tempting to float around the danger zone of 8 to 9 infection cards, you really can't stick around that level. So it leads to situations where you have to be planning to explore early on. And it helps you incentivize picking up cards you might not pick up normally. Sure, knives and pistols aren't very effective late game, but you might want to pick some up early to help take the slack off your early explorers. The next most expansion is the Alliance expansion. This is the only standalone expansion for Resident Evil the deck building game, which means it contains all the cards you need to play without needing the base game. The most important rule that comes with the Alliance expansion is the ability to play with partners. Partners allows you to play Resident Evil the deck building game with 2 characters. That means you've got 2 bodies that can take damage, explore the mansion, can level up to give you new abilities. But most importantly, your partner has 2 weapon slots for weapons that you can assign to your partner that don't get shuffled back into your deck. So it gives you constant access to weapons that you don't necessarily have to draw, allowing you to be far more consistent with what you have access to every turn as you're exploring the mansion deck. Overall, I don't prefer the Alliance expansion over the base game, at least in terms of the market cards and the mansion deck. I prefer to play with the base game cards as opposed to the Alliance cards, but I do incorporate lots of elements of the Alliance expansion into my preferred version, particularly the partner mechanic, but again, we'll talk about that more in a second. Next up is the Mercenaries expansion. Now, aside from the extra cards it adds to your card pool, the expansion adds 2 very, very important additions. It adds skill cards and new ammo cards. The skill cards give you some more variation in your play. They give you new toys to play with, which is essentially a set of new special abilities that you can use and you can level up like you do your character's main abilities. Anytime you get new toys to play with, it's always a good thing, so I appreciate that. But the ammo cards are the real draw in this expansion. The new ammo cards all have a special ability on them, which allows you to more easily upgrade your lower level ammo cards into the higher level ammo cards. This is a welcome addition as it reduces the number of turns you're just buying more money, which is a common complaint in Dominion and really deck building games as a whole. Turns where it's like, well, I don't have anything else to do, so I guess I'm going to buy a higher power money card and hopefully get more money for the future. The Mercenaries ammo cards give you ways to just do that passively, usually by killing monsters or doing things like that. So it helps you increase the power of your deck while doing things that you want to be doing anyway, and that's something that I appreciate. The last expansion is the Nightmare expansion. This doesn't add any new mechanics to the game, but it adds a ton of new cards, which is always good. And so realistically, you could pick this one up last. You could pick it up as your first expansion. Either way, just because having a bigger card pool is always a good thing. New weapons, new actions, another monster mansion deck to go through. Deck builders are the kind of games where I really don't think you can get too much content. Like, I always want to have more variation, more options to play with. And so that's just what this expansion provides. So to sum all that up, if you had to prioritize expansions, you couldn't get them all at once because honestly that would be pretty expensive. I would pick up the base game and then the Outbreak expansion. From there, it's kind of a toss-up. You could pick up Alliance next, or you could pick up the Mercenaries expansion next. You don't necessarily need the Alliance box to play with the partner rules, but there are character cards that come with the Alliance expansion that play specifically into the partner role. And that's kind of a cool dynamic to have, cards that play off each other, off that partner mechanic. But I could see wanting to pick up Mercenaries next because those ammo cards are absolutely choice to have, and the skill cards are a lot of fun to play with. And then last, probably the Nightmare expansion, just because it doesn't add any new mechanics to the game, but I love just the additions to the card pool that it provides. So, with all that being said, that leads into my ideal version of Resident Evil the deck building game. I incorporate a little bit from pretty much all the expansions, If you're fortunate enough to have access to all of them or to most of them, this is, in my opinion, the definitive way to play. First off, you will want to pick whatever market you want. Using the market from the Outbreak expansion is probably your best bet because it has some cards that allow you to deal with infection level to kind of mitigate that a little bit. And by the same token, probably also use the Mansion deck from the Outbreak expansion. It has monsters that kind of deal with infection level, but it also includes a couple antidote cards that allow you to reduce infection level. So for the first few plays, use either the base game or the Outbreak recommended market setups, but use the Outbreak Mansion deck. In addition to using the Outbreak Mansion deck, I cut the deck in half and I shuffle the big baddie, the big monster, into the second half of the deck and then place the first half of the deck on top of it. That will stop a player from picking up the big baddie boss monster in the first couple turns. I've done that myself and it's not fun, but there's still plenty of big baddies in the deck you have to be wary of. It's just going to give you a little bit of time and a little bit of leeway before you start hitting a guy that can one hit a lot of characters in the game and kill them right away, which makes you skip a turn. Next up is you include the infection deck. Obviously, that should probably seem obvious after talking about it when I talked about the Outbreak expansion. The infection deck is a must include, I think, no matter what combination and setup you use, just because of that great pacing it gives to the game. It really just improves the experience overall. The third thing I include is the rules for playing with partners from Alliance, but I tweak it a little bit so that every partner can only carry one weapon instead of two. Allowing your partners to slot in two weapons is a little broken. Even if they're just carrying two knives, that's 10 flat damage just every turn. And let's be honest, in most cases, you're not going to be slotting them with two knives. You're going to give them a shotgun and a pistol or two shotguns or something. As a whole, it makes exploring far too easy. It doesn't really change the beginning of the game much, but it accelerates you to the point where you're not really, worried at all while you're going through the mansion deck, and it kind of removes that sense of tension. But one weapon seems perfectly balanced. It allows you some more flexibility in your deck building, but still gives you options for exploring successfully and makes the exploring the mansion process much less painful. Lastly, I include the ammo cards and the skill cards from Mercenaries, just using the standard rules. They are great additions. I could see cutting the skill cards out for your first game, but after you've played a couple times, definitely include those in. But by all means, play with those ammo cards. They are a huge improvement to the overall game, and I highly recommend them. So, there you have it, the definitive way to play Resident Evil, the deck building game. If you have a chance to give that a try, you're a lucky person, and you can see why it's just about my favorite deck building game. To give a quick summary, so you don't have to go back and re-listen to that if you're trying to reference it, play with the market from the base game or the Outbreak expansion, but use the Mansion deck from the Outbreak expansion. Split the Mansion deck into two halves, put the big baddie in the second half, shuffle it together, and then put the first half of the deck back on top of it. Play with the Infection deck. Include the rules for playing with partners from Alliance, but tweak it so that every partner can only carry one weapon instead of two, and then include the ammo cards. If it's your first game, skip the skill cards, but for really almost second game on, include the skill cards for Mercenaries. Unfortunately, the only downside I have, even with these tweaks that make Resident Evil a great game, is I don't know how available it is. This is a game that I've owned for the better part of a decade now, and for a long time it was out of print until like about a year ago when a massive printing just hit stores out of nowhere. So I'm guessing it could always happen again. The publisher is Bandai, as I said before, which is kind of a strange publisher. I don't know how many board games Bandai publishes. And so my guess is they might push out printings of this game in conjunction with video game releases. Maybe that's what they do. They sold well, like they sold out. So there's a demand for it. And so I imagine, keep your eyes open if you don't want to buy a copy of the game off the secondary market. And I'm guessing that more printings will come down the line. Because Bandai isn't a dedicated board game publisher, I don't think it's likely that you'll be able to find any information on incoming print runs. But I suppose you might be able to get in contact with their customer service to see if they've got something coming. I don't know. But yeah, that was Resident Evil, the deck building game. One of my favorite games of all time. Probably my favorite deck building game of all time, all things considered. Even considering trains. I love it. It's great. I don't you know, what with all the games that are coming out these days, the Cult of the New and all that, I don't get to play it enough, but I highly recommend it. And if I ever see you at a convention, I'm happy to crack it out and play. That was Resident Evil, the deck building game, designed by Tyler Allender and published by Bandai. Well, that is it for me today. I'm amazed that I was able to get this pushed out with all the turkey and stuffing and whatnot in my belly. And I hope that you had a great Thanksgiving. I hope you didn't have to watch too much football. Please have a great weekend. Play some games. Any of your Black Friday purchases if you were crazy enough to go out and deal with all the madness. And I will see you next week. My name is Ryan Krim. I'm signing off. Please email me if you want to get in touch with me at learnyourownrules@gmail.com or tweet me at LYORules. And you know what we say, game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.